we welcome you, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning to all. And happy to be back in this platform. Earlier we were actually with the state level participants, and I thank M. S. Swaminathan Foundation for this kind of an opportunity, where seldom people speak about the lifeline of India, the rivers. And for India, and you can ask me the questions at any point of time. You need not wait for the final slides to be over. So in India, see, when you speak about rivers, basically many kind of people, right from the father of our nation, and all these have something similar. You start with the Native Americans who earlier spoke about the importance of native ecosystems and the rivers, and our political leaders also, they consider rivers as the heart of the Indian soul, and that is why the rivers are so important as far as India is concerned. And also we have the sacred rivers which actually flow not only through the landscape but through our heart and through our mindscape, and that is why this is very important. And then when you speak about the future of the world, the political slogan is actually we all wanted to live in a world which is better, and that is actually the political slogan which has driven many of the the political systems into power. And then what we are actually intending to do, I am not going into the politics of the entire issue, but about the goals to achieve by 2030 in the form of sustainable development goals. And if you look at the sustainable development goals, starting with the number 1, removing poverty or no poverty, no hunger, and then health, education, and many of the other concerned activities, and specifically the activities connected with the ecosystem management, including climate action, life below water, item number 14, which is connected with the preservation of life underwater. There also you would see that the thrust is always preservation of life in ocean, not in the freshwater systems. And that is one other thing, when we speak about development also. And then look at the two Indias. Again, it's a very controversial topic. Again, I am not going into discuss further on that, the two Indias. Now, on one side, we see the developed India with all these kind of the GDP growth rate what Professor Ramachandra was speaking about. And look at one city, as you can see here in this photograph, the slum of Mumbai on one side, and the richest people in the country living on the other side of India. So when we speak about development in India, this is always there. And when we speak about the rivers, the same is the case. And this is Umkot River in Meghalaya. This is one of the cleanest rivers in the world. One of the cleanest rivers. So every part of the river you will see the bottom, and the water is pristine, and primarily because the catchment is healthy, and ultimately it drives the water clear, and there is no human in the population density is also less in the catchment area, and people, so since it's very close to the civilization which actually consider earth as the mother, and now the people the disturbance to the system is very less, so we have one of the cleanest rivers in the world in India. And we have few of the world's most polluted river systems in India, and that's why I am speaking about two Indias when we speak about the river systems also, not with the sustainable development goals. So this is something which probably we have to understand, because we have within India, we have two typical examples of the cleanest river in India and the most polluted river in India. So that's another paradox as far as India is concerned, and how do we do that, and that's probably what we have to discuss further. So in this talk of 1 hour, I will be speaking specifically on river ecology and river health, and how to redefine the river conservation paradigms for India. And this is primarily my intention of the talk, and where I'll speak about river ecology, all the basic things. And before that, I just wanted to know how many of the participants are working in some topic related to the rivers in this group. You can raise the hand. Okay, many people are working in this line. So I'll be speaking specifically about river ecology, and I'll be focusing specifically on river continuum concept, which probably many of you are aware. And then the major threats vis-a-vis conservation and the river health and restoration, which I am not detailing primarily because it's already spoken about, and then framework for river health, and why there is a system failure in India as far as river conservation is concerned. And we have few success stories and what is actually the reason for that, and then how do we move forward. Okay, so we'll start, probably you will see it as, since I need some kind of continuity, I'll start from the scratch to define a river ecosystem. And three things are very, very important when you consider a river. Whatever may be the topic you are working with, maybe a social issue or an ecological issue, or some kind of other issues connected with the river, maybe a spiritual or religious issue, whatever may be. The three things are very important if you really consider it as an ecosystem. One, it should flow. Okay, because that's why it's called a river. That means there should be minimum amount of water available, and that we will finally discuss as environmental flow. And second is, it's nothing but a flow of energy. And if you are working with physics, then ultimately this is the energy which is transferred from one level of the catchment area down to the coastal area. As far as a small state like Kerala is concerned, the coastal productivity is primarily the contribution of the rivers in the system. And that is why you should understand the connectivity between the river flowing from the Western Ghats to the Arabian Sea, or in the east coast a glacier lake or a river, and like Ganga, which flows from the Himalayas and ultimately reaches the Bay of Bengal. So it actually carries energy, not energy and matter, and the nutrient in the form of nutrients. So the three things are very, very important when we discuss about the river as a living system or as a discrete ecological unit. And you consider three things. One, of course, is the flow of water, and second is actually the flow of energy, and third is the flow of nutrients, or the amount of nutrients it carries right from its beginning till it reaches the ocean. So these three things are very, very important when you speak about the river. But unfortunately, in the discussions, there are two, why the river is actually not a discussion, a political discussion or a social discussion, is primarily because if I am a biologist, I speak only about biology of the system. And if you are an ecologist, you speak only about the ecology. And if you are working with the sociology, social aspects, and you will speak only about the social aspects. And then if you are a religious leader, for example, many of the religious festivals are connected with the river in India, then you speak about, you consider it as only as a spiritual entity and not as an ecological entity or another entity. So this kind of piecemeal operations are happening with regard to the river. And that is one reason why river conservation per se is not actually a political movement or a people's movement in India, because it is compartmentalized. And this compartmentalization ultimately lead to all this kind of the failure in the system, and that is what I am trying to explain. Okay, and then second aspect probably which you have to discuss is actually the interdisciplinarity in river research. And this is what Dr. Ramachandra also said in the earlier lecture, and this is an interdisciplinary subject, because I am basically a biologist or ecologist, but I cannot define a river because I am speaking only about the ecological components there. But it is actually connected with ecology, it's connected with the livelihood of large number of people. That means it's a social well-being, and ultimately it is actually, as far as a country like India is concerned, you speak about a religion or no religion, but it is also connected with the spirituality in this nation. So this is actually an interdisciplinary component, and that is the reason why this is very important. And this paper, I'll share the slides also with you after this, and then you look at this very recent paper, very interesting paper, Understanding Rivers and their social relationship. And this is very important because you cannot consider only it as an ecological discrete unit, but it has a social connectivity as well. And then that means river flows connect people, places, and other forms of life, inspiring and sustaining diverse cultural beliefs, values, and the ways of life. So this is very important. That means stakeholders are very, very important when you speak about the rivers. And another thing which probably is new to you is called the Brisbane Declaration on Global Action Agenda on Environmental Flows, which I will discuss later also, but I am not detailing it because there is a separate talk on environmental flows by Ravi. Okay, so environmental flows, what is the essence of the Brisbane Declaration? And it says that it's actually a new concept wherein the health of the river is connected with the environmental flow, one thing. And then, this is also, this is environmental flow, how it is connected with the society, and how it is connected with the relationship between the environmental or river governance, etc., which we will discuss in the last few slides. Okay. And then when you look at the riverine ecosystem per se, why this is important, and the importance is primarily because we will be seeing river in different regions. For example, if you are living in the highland area, you will be seeing the origin of the river sometimes, and then if you are a midland people like now we are sitting here, and on the other side you will see the river Pamba flowing, and you will be seeing the fifth order stream or sixth order stream, and it is actually one part of the river, not the entire river system. But if you move towards the end of your training course, you will visit the lake, ultimately where the Pamba reaches, and then you will see an entirely different kind of scenario. But unless and until you see the river in a holistic manner, you will not understand why the river systems are important in each and every part of the system. So you can see that, in a river, for example, this is the case with most of the river systems in India. It will have a catchment area which ultimately pump in or the water throughout the system, and then when the river flows down the midland and the coastal area, you will see that the water and the energy and the nutrients are supplied to different components in the system, and then you will also see unique systems developed when the water flows out of the system, because you will be seeing only the channel, but during the monsoon season or during the rainy season, the water flows out. When the water flows out, it fills the the nearby areas. We call it floodplains. Okay, and in the floodplains, during the evolutionary history, it might have developed a large number of unique ecosystems like wetlands. Okay, in different components. For example, if you look at the Western Ghats, for example, and if you look at we have a series of unique wetlands which are not yet classified, scientifically. For example, there are some salt areas. These are called salty swamps in the Irraviculam National Park, for example, which is not actually designated in any of the typical wetland types, where the soil is salty, and which of course is one of the material which the elephants also feed just to avoid the scarcity of the salt in their body. Again, so these are kind of, then when you also yesterday probably Shaji might have discussed about the Myristica swamps, again another kind of unique wetlands, of course driven out of the water, which is connected with the river systems in some way or other during the evolutionary history of its development. And when you come down to the coastal area, then you have a series of coastal wetlands which are actually supplied with the water from the river. So you can see that when the river, in the evolutionary history of the river, you will also see that river also finally, ultimately help developing a series of other wetlands connected with that. So that means this is the comprehensiveness with which we have to see the river. Okay. Then, when you another important feature of the river is the water flow is always unidirectional. Okay, and then normally when there is a downhill flow of water, there will be some continuous physical changes happening in the river. That means the river you are seeing today may not be the same which you see tomorrow, because every time, every second, there will be some kind of physical changes happening with the river. So what are the major physical changes happen? One is actually erosion and downstream transportation and deposition of sediments. This will be happening. And since the human beings, we were clever enough to understand that the rich organic soil carried by the rivers are ultimately deposited in the floodplain. And this is the area we initially started the agricultural practices, and that's why you can see all these kind of agricultural practices and the development of cultural civilizations along the river basins throughout the world. Okay, and some of the civilizations were lost primarily because we lost water connectivity, and you look at any other major civilizations, including the civilizations in India. Okay, and then links to the floodplains. And the flood is basically not a problem with the river. Flood is actually part of the life cycle of the river. During the monsoon season, river does flow out, and then and it actually fills the floodplains, and this is part of the life cycle. And all the living systems, including fishes in the system, their life pattern is connected with that. For example, when the river water flows out during the monsoon season, fishes undertake lateral migration. Okay, they move out, they reaches the floodplains, they breed there, including in the rice fields, and when the water recedes, the young ones also get into the main river channel. So that means it's connected with the life cycle of the river. The life cycle of the fish and life cycle of the living system is actually complementary. And then it also changes the linear morphology and ecology of the system. And then other kind of equilibrium which we'll speak about later. And then the catchments of the river ultimately connect the land with the sea, and that's what we'll see. And then when you look at the three-dimensional picture of river, you should understand that river corridor is something which you see as a river channel, and the river channel basically changes with the time and the space. This is something which you have to understand as a basic ecology of the river. Okay, because there will be lateral changes happening because of the flood and other related cyclic events, and there will be longitudinal changes which happens primarily because the river flows overflows during the monsoon seasons, and also there is some vertical changes happening when the water and the sediment, there will be an interaction always happening, and when you mine the sand, actually that balance will be lost. So this kind of three-dimensional activity always happening in the river should be understood before we understand the ecology of the river. That means there will be lateral changes happening when the river flows, and there will be longitudinal changes because it carries water and the energy and nutrients, and also there will be vertical changes happening primarily because there will be always an interaction between the flowing water above and the flowing water below and the substratum in between. That we will discuss later. Okay. And then when you look at the river length, any river, maybe it is a small river originating, because for example, the rivers in Kerala, even a river of 18 kilometers, we call it as a river. It may be a channel, it may be a canal, but it may be a larger river system like Ganges, but you can see always longitudinal classification will be the same. Maybe it is a Mississippi River or Amazon River, the classification will be the same because there will be the source zone, or this is called the headwaters, from where the first order streams originate, and then there will be a transfer zone, or this is called the midland zone, where actually there will be transfer of materials primarily because the velocity of water is less, and that is an area where the sediments are transferred to the lateral plains, and there you will see the rice fields and the highly productive zones. And finally, the areas where the river deposits all its sediments, and this is the deposition zone. We will call it as the river mouth or whatever it be. It may be the estuarine zone there. So this kind of longitudinal zone will be the same. And then Senocity. And then remember, no river in the world is straight, because it takes its own course, and then it depends upon the topography of the system. And as a result, there will be unique systems formed in a large number of rivers. And then there is an index to calculate the Senocity of the river, and that is called the Senocity Index. And if it is more than 1.3, and the river is considered as meandering. Okay, so if you consider the index of the Senocity above 1.3, we will consider it as a meandering river, or highly the curved or looped. So you can see that that blue line represents the straight line, and then you can see the meandering. Okay, the meandering always depends upon the geographical setting of that particular area, and also the way in which the river takes the flow. Okay, so the meandering is also very important. For example, in the modern days of flood management, for example, there is an issue with managing flood in a town. Okay, if the river flows through a town, near the town, and then there is always an issue with the flooding, continuous flooding during the monsoon. What the environmental managers in the modern times does is that, for example, suppose this is the river, meandering. Okay, and then normally you can see that here you can see a meandering here. Okay, that means it's a severe meandering, and during the monsoon season always there will be breakage in this bund, and then it overflows into the nearby urban area. And what during as a part of flood management strategy, what the river managers does now is actually they will straighten this river. Okay, they remove this, they create a barrier here and straighten this river, so that the flood can be avoided in the city. And this is because this is a highly inhabited area. But unfortunately, what happens now during the these are the river floodplains, and we actually inhabit inside the river floodplain, and then complain that the flooding is actually this is the problem with the river. This is just like the human wildlife conflict. We actually create house settlement inside their corridor, and then we consider that as the problem with the system. So this is also happening these days. And then another thing, probably when you go to the field, you will also see this kind of variation. And the three kinds of systems are there in the river. When you look at the river channel, and see, when a line passing, a theoretical line passing through the center of the river channel is called the midstream. Okay. And then you have pools somewhere where the depth of the water will be less, and there will be riffles at certain point of time. And then there will be alternating pools and riffles when in the midland area. In the midland area, that you have to always understand. And pools are formed in the midstream next to the outside bank of a water course bend. Pools are not formed always. For example, if there is a bend in this region, normally there will be a circling of water here, and that will create a pool. Okay, and so that means this will be an important area for fishes, because these are the areas which are deep, and the fishes used to take shelter in this area, especially during the summer season, or during some, the summer season. Sometimes some streams, the remaining part may dry off, and we will have water only in this pool area. And when there is a pool, normally the water will flow close to the, after that the water will flow close to the banks of the river. And as a result, some area you will always see the riffles. Okay, so this kind of, based on the nature and topography, you will see the pools and the riffles in a stream naturally. Okay. And then, if you look at the structure of the system or a riverine system, you will see alternating structures also. And then river width is usually calculated and the river bed. Okay, and then a river bed has what is actually the status of river bed? It depends upon many of the factors. What will be there in the river bed? For example, in some area you will see the gravel, some area you will see the sand, some area it will be mud, sometimes it may be the boulders. It all depends upon the energy in the system, flow of water in the system, and also the resistance of the substratum. All the things depends upon again the geographical features, and also the width of the system. How much width will be in a particular region. It also depends upon the substratum, the geographical setting of the system, etc. And then river equilibrium is the river equilibrium is reached when all the four variables are balanced, especially the flow of water, the substratum, the amount of the width of the system. All the things are connected with the river equilibrium. And another point which you have to remember basically as a foundation to realizing the river ecology is a term called the invisible water. For example, you see the river surface flow, okay, and then you will be seeing the bottom of the river, and there will be actually percolation of water happening parallelly, and there will be a flow of water beneath, and that is called the invisible water. And this invisible water, the flow is very, very important in sustaining the health of the river. Primarily because this is the water which actually finally enter into the groundwater in the nearby area, and it all depends upon the nature of the substratum. For example, if it is a sandy bottom, which is ideal in many cases of Indian rivers, and then normally the percolation of water will be more, okay, and because there will be larger interstitial spaces which allow again more friction on the surface between the surface water and the bed material, and that will allow the water to stay in the interstitial spaces, one, and also it will allow the water to flow down, or percolation of water. So sand is very, very important, and that is the reason why when you remove the sand from the river, you are actually disturbing many systems. For example, one, the living systems. For example, if the sand is removed in large number, normally the percolation of water, the speed of percolation will come down, one. And second, these interstitial spaces are the areas where there will be large number of microorganisms which actually ultimately determine the self-purification power of the river. Because the river water, as you can see, when the muddy water ultimately become clean after it flows through some distances. And even the pollutants inside the system are cleaned by the microbes which are present in the bed material, especially in the sand material. And the sand interstitial fauna is also another important thing in the riverbed. So all these things make the bed material very, very important. And the invisible river is the underground floodplains, which are the foundation of the river health, primarily because this provides the immune system for the river. Because all the microbes which ultimately recycle the nutrients and detoxify the materials, and also play a very, very important role in maintaining the health of the ecosystem, live in the bed material and the river bottom. And that is the reason why the underground floodplains are often called the immune system for the river, because they play a very, very important role in river recycling and river health. Then look at the system. And normally, especially in political arguments used in many areas of India, you see that the river water flows. The river water flows, ultimately it is emptied into the ocean without any use. This is the argument. So this is a water which flow without any kind of service. And you can see from A to K. I'm not explaining everything. For example, if you start with the first one, the microbes, and they are the ones which actually recycle the nutrients and pump in the nutrients into the system. So they have this role. And second is the crustaceans, or there's a macro invertebrates, where you have a practical session also, which play a very, very important role in the food web of the system. And then another thing is actually the temperature modification of the surface habitat, and where the water flows down and reaches the system. And D is actually the bed material with the sufficient habitat, spaces for breeding of the fish. And then we move up, there will be other organisms which depend upon the river for its survival. And when you move up along the riparian vegetation, where you had a talk yesterday, the importance of riparian system, and the animals there, including the ungulates and the mammals, they depend upon the system for their survival. So you can see that every inch of the area, right from the bed material to the marginal vegetation and the buffer zone, the organisms depend upon the river system for their survival. So that means the gravel bed of the floodplain, and they are the ecological agents which support the biodiversity in the nearby regions. Yes.
Sir, you're saying how sediment transport is one important aspect that the river does carry out.
Yes.
And how the coastal productivity depends a lot on the health of the river.
Yes.
I've also heard how the dams actually hold huge amounts of sediments, right?
Hmm.
So when you have large dams right in the beginning of the river, how do we know how it's affecting the habitat along the river, in the coast, because of that huge sediment that's not coming anymore?
Yeah, that is one of the problem of the river. We speak about other issues connected with the river, but what it primarily does is actually it cut off the subsurface flow. That is one issue, which ultimately determine the health of the system. And second, sediments. This is actually a lotic system or a flowing system. And when you construct a dam, ultimately, temporarily, for the time being, you are actually converting that into a lentic system. That means you are changing the ecology of the system in a larger manner. That's second issue. And third is actually the way in which the faunal changes happens in the system. The slow transformation of the system which happens with regard to the biodiversity in the system. And then of course the changes in the environmental flow, which we will be discussing about that. And then the way in which it ultimately block the whole energy and matter flow in the system. For example, many of the dams, not only it traps the sediments, along with that it traps the nutrients as well. So that means you are changing the nutrient composition in the downstream areas as well in the long run. So all these changes are the minute changes which ultimately happen when a dam is constructed across the healthy river systems, and that is important. That we'll discuss further on that. Okay. And then floodplain. Already we had a discussion about the floodplain, why this is important, and theoretically, it can be divided into hydrological floodplain and topographical floodplain, which I am not explaining in detail. Well, ultimately, the floodplains, or the water which the buffer zones receive from the river, basically, they also determine the health of the river system, because they are integral part of the river system. You cannot consider only the channel as the river, but the water which is actually transferred laterally and till the area where it is transferred, this is the buffer zone. Earlier there was actually a question on the buffer zone. How will you define a buffer zone theoretically? These are the areas where the water ultimately during the flood time it enters, and then that can be considered as an area where the the buffer zone of the area. Unfortunately, in the modern developmental plans, that will never come. We always limit the buffer zones of a river based on our own criteria. We defined and redefined year after year based on our convenience. Okay. And then, and the river depth basically is another factor. It depends again upon the topography. I'm not explaining it. And, when you, another two important feature connected with the river is the water cycle. How that Dr. Ramachandra also explained it, and the way in which it support the water cycle. That means the vaporization and of course the transfer of water to other components in the system. And this is also connected with the water cycle is also in a given area is also influenced by the river. Okay. And then the sediment transportation. Sediment transportation is very, very important, as we discussed earlier. And then riverbed processes. And sometimes, the riverbed also, it's a dynamic system due to several reasons. The change in the course of the river and the land use changes which we purposefully make. All these things ultimately lead to the changes in the topography of the river. Sometimes naturally, the meandering may disappear. And we have a typical example nearby. A small river called Varatar, which was actually part of river Pamba and later got separated as a separate entity. And you can see several examples like that, including in India. In India, many of the lagoons are actually formed as a result of this. When a main river, the meandering is cut off separately from the major river, and the meandering part, which is separated, and then it acts as an oxbow lake. Okay, it has an oxbow shape, and it's got separated, and then it may function separately as an independent ecosystem, and this is called oxbow lake. Okay, so this is also formed as a result of the changes which is happening in the river bed during the course of the evolution of the river or changes in the river. Riparian vegetation, yesterday there was a talk on that, so I am not detailing it, and its high importance, how the nutrient flows help in the system. And then there are also river biocorridors. For example, many of the biodiversity associated with the river, they actually got transferred between the systems through these biocorridors. But unfortunately, when we have land use changes along the river basins, and then we cut off many of these corridors and ultimately limiting the passage of animals in between. And then this concept, and I'm coming back to the concept of river continuum. River continuum is basically a concept or a conceptual model which predicts how the biotic systems they respond to the physical changes along the river basins, and how the biodiversity within the riverbed changes when we come from the headwaters to the coastal area. Okay, how does it change? And then this is called the river continuum concept, because this is why the engineering concept of river and the biological or ecological concept of the river is entirely different. For example, if you look at any of the engineers, and that is the reason why any engineers here in this group who have completed engineering? No. Okay, so many of ultimately the problem with the management of the river is ultimately the management is done by the engineers in the country. And for them, river, they have only the channel in their mindscape. Okay, it's only a channel and not the supporting systems nearby, and they consider it as a pipe where they can bend it, and according to their wish they can cut it and then rejoin it at some kind of places. And that is why that's how the whole river linking concept also came with that concept, without any kind of concept on the continuum philosophy of the river. And what is the concept? Basically, when you look at different areas of the river, and the biodiversity, the living system changes with every segment of the river, and each one has its own functional role. For example, if you look at the headwaters, and then you will see that the proposition of the organisms also changes, as you can see here. And this is why, do you need a huge project to study the health of the river? Now, I would argue that it is not required. It is not required. What you need is a passion, and also if you have school children along with you, tell them that this is actually the ecology of the river, and then you can monitor the ecology of the river primarily by looking at the living systems there. And if you can identify some of the major groups of insects, and which is actually pollution tolerant, which actually is a health indicator, if you can have a basic data on that, then in a country like India, with huge amount of the youth in the country, almost 45% is below 35 years, and then you can see that this population or the school children can create immense amount of data, Because unfortunately what we does is that, even for a school children, we ask them to do some genetic engineering work, theoretically, and present a project that you will create artificial embryo, you will create synthetic organisms or synthetic organs within the laboratory. Fine, this can be done. And even now, now that Singapore has agreed with the lab meat, you have read in the newspaper, because you from the stem cells you can create beef from the stem cells, and the first country to give approval for the laboratory meat is called lab meat. You can search and find out. Singapore is the first country to give sanction for that. And then their argument is very simple. Madam asked a question about the amount of water consumed in for producing 1 kg of beef. But that is all theoretical, basically. That data is available in the website. So that data is basically based on the farming conditions in unit area. That is why your argument was correct in that sense as well. Okay, and then the issue is that their argument is that all the kind of the animal farms in the modern day, they consume huge amount of water. Definitely, no doubt about that. And there is also an interesting argument. For example, now the most populous countries in the world. A few minutes I'll be moving away from the main topic. And there is an argument that the India, it's not a major issue, primarily because still we have a lot of vegetarians in this country. But the modern the issue with the modern generation or the modern times is that the middle class is getting more income, and then ultimately when the middle class get more income, what ultimately happens? We spend more money on food, and our food preference will change ultimately, and then we will move towards non-vegetarian food. And when we move towards non-vegetarian food, and ultimately what happens? The more amount of grains, food grains, which we are supposed to eat, will be pumped towards the cattle farms or cattle feed factories. And that is happening even now. For example, India and China, we have almost 1/3 of the global population. And now both the countries are exporting rice, for example. And then the population goes beyond, and by 2030, 2035, India will become the most populous country in the world, more mouths to feed, and then there will be scarcity of rice or cereals in the immediate future, globally. And then normally, the people are more becoming non-vegetarians, and there will be more poultry farms, more cattle farms throughout the world. And then you can see that most of the animal feed ingredients actually come from food grains. And now in Kerala, the average price of the fish has gone almost 4 times. The small scale or the so-called trash fish, and which used to support the nutritional security of the coastal people as well as the poor communities in the world, because they were getting fish at a cheaper rate. Now, no small fish is available in the coast, and no waste of fish is there, because all these fishes are now used by the animal companies, mainly for aquaculture feed, because they need high quality protein in the feed, and all these are taken up, and as a result the average price of the fish is going up. This is one. I'll come to that. Okay, and then the issue is that normally based on the demand from the market, our farming practices will change slowly, and then normally this is a globalized village, and there will be more demand of meat, means there will be more cereals pumped into the animal feed manufacturing companies, and then there will be more use of water. And then you can also look at the history history of struggle between Tamil Nadu and Karnataka on the issue of Kaveri water. And all these changes happen primarily because the older farming practices have changed. In many of the areas, they started growing sugarcane. And the amount of water required for producing 1 hectare of sugarcane is almost 4 times more than that of rice. And then normally, then the demand of water is entirely different, in addition to the other demands, water demands along the valley. So all these things ultimately change. That means even the farming changes in some countries, and the demand in the market will ultimately drive the water requirement upside down, and it will jeopardize the whole system. So that means all these things are connected in a way, directly or indirectly. And coming to your question.
Over the past 65 years. So the problem isn't really coast consumption of fish by coastal communities. communities, the problem is consumption of fish itself through bottom trawling. If it was done on a very small scale by the fishing community who go into the deep seas on their own tiny boats, the problem wouldn't exist. And we don't really, bottom trawling is not banned in India. And only
Not banned anywhere in the world.
Yeah, it is not banned, but at least they have.
Sorry, I have to support my country. It's been banned in Belize in the West,
Where?
Belize.
Yeah, yes. And see, it was actually not banned but controlled in the small island developing nations where the people actually, the stakeholders actually regulate the fishing exercise. And that is where ultimately we also have to come. But that again, in a country like India where the sea is an open regime, again it's a difficulty. Your question is correct. There are two issues. One, the overexploitation that is happening on the other part in the ocean. Okay, that is true. And then bottom trawling, for example, I'll tell you, because I work in that area in the bycatch issue also, biodiversity related issue. Since it's a deviation from the topic, I'm not, we'll discuss it later, but one point there. But for example, bottom trawling is for the general awareness of all the participants here is actually a technique to catch the bottom living shrimps, which are in high demand in the international market. Okay, and this is actually a technique developed in Norway, where Norwegian waters, cooler waters, where biodiversity is almost less, almost nil. And then that technique was introduced in India. And then we started actually using the same technology for catching shrimps, which are abundant in this region. But unfortunately, in a trawl net, only 20% may be shrimps, and remaining 80% may be the other organism. That means we are incidentally killing all these organisms, and this is called the bycatch. And it ultimately has driven overcapitalization also, because all the ordinary fishers in this state in India, ultimately they became the servants in the trawl boats owners, because the trawl boats may be worth several crores. It can be owned only by the larger companies or the richer individuals, and they all became the employees. This is again a social change which is happening there, in addition to the ecological changes.
Could I please add one more point? You were talking about food preferences, and in India only around 39% of the population is vegetarian. But when we talk about meat-eating Indians, which is 69% of Indians, their per capita consumption is still one of the least in the world. I think the second least, because the amount that a family eats in India for one single meal is what probably a person eats for their snack somewhere in the West. So it is not just about completely, because you need a very diversified diet. If you're depending on rice, any of the staples, it's not being grown on a very biodiverse plantation. It's monoculture. It's monocropping that is being done. So going completely vegetarian, you're not really helping. If your source of grains or pulses is from a monocrop plantation, that is not a sustainable method either. So I think
yes, I agree with the system, because that's why the Indian system continued to be sustainable primarily because we had a diversified kind of diet.
Yes.
That is true. But I am speaking about the modern food habits and the modern, like if you look at the burger or if you look at the other materials which are actually the so-called junk food, and where the non-vegetarian compound demand is globally there.
Yes.
And that doesn't mean that the demand is the Indian cattle farms are increasing primarily because of demand within India. No. It's actually it's actually the international demand as well, because it's a global market and supply the materials like that. Anyway, so if you have you will be seeing this in the practical session as well. The different components of the organisms in different segments of the river. And for example, if you look at the domination of organisms, you can see, and in the top or in the headwaters of the river, there will be more organisms which actually use the plants as the feeding material. So there will be more shredders which actually shred or cut the leaves and feed on them. And there will be large number of macroinvertebrates also in the system, but the benthic animals will be less in that system because it's a rapidly flowing system. But at the same time, when these organisms cut the leaf, and then the organic content of the organic load in that system, in the streams, will be very high. That organic materials will be ultimately decomposed by the organisms there, and the nutrients are supplied back. And when you come down, then in the middle stream of the system, and naturally the shredders, the organism which actually shred the leaves, their number decreases. At the same time, the organism which actually use the biological materials or the organic material, their concentration increases. At the same time, this will be the transfer zone. Benthic system will be much stronger. So you can see a larger domination of benthic organisms there, which can ultimately use these energy sources from there. And when you come down to the estuarine region or towards the sea, you will see that the benthic system are much stronger, because this is a deposition zone where there will be benthic organism, benthic macroinvertebrates dominate the system. There will not be any shredders, because there is no organic matter to shred actually, but the organism which utilize the nutrients will be much higher in the system. So you can see that each of the segment of the river is dominated by different kinds of organisms, and their sustenance is actually connected with the amount of matter and energy in the system, and that is ultimately the concept of river continuum. So river is actually a continuum, a living system where each component is dominated by different kinds of organism, and the energy and matter produced by each segment of this organism will ultimately sustain the energy and flow of matter downstream. So that's basically the concept. You have to actually, you can define it and by heart the definition, but that is a different concept. But this is the concept through which you have to understand the whole concept of river continuum. Yes. So normally the riparian vegetation, riparian forest will be dominating in the region, especially in the midstream region, and in the upper reaches definitely will be the evergreen forest. That's a different kind of a system, and where the rivers are not the primary factor, but the geography is the major factor. But towards the coastal area, there will be a different kind of salt tolerating vegetation in the form of mangroves appearing in the lower stream of the river. Okay, so. Ultimately, you can consider, you can classify these functional groups as, which I am not detailing primarily because you have a practical session there. Shredders, which can actually tear the particulate organic matter, coarse particulate organic matter. There will be scrappers, especially in the headwaters, which actually scrap the material, grazers, biofilms, and then piercers, the organism which actually pierce and find out the food material. Collectors, which actually collect the fine particulate organic matter, and then predators. So these are the organisms which are the functional unit of the river system, which you will practically see. And also, if you are studying different segments, you can see their composition also changes along the course of the river. And when you move down the course of the river, then you can see that the river ultimately help in sustaining a series of wetlands along its path. And there is another concept also. It's called the fish zonation concept. Basically, I am not again going into the details. Each zone of the river has its own very peculiar fish fauna, depending upon its adaptations. And for example, if in the head zone, you will see only the organisms which are sensitive, fishes which are sensitive to water oxygen concentration in water, which have with varying adaptation to cling on to the fast flowing water, etc., etc. When you come to the middle zone, you will see the commercially valuable fishes are richest in that area, and they have a different kind of life pattern as well, because they undergo lateral migration also. And when you come to the estuarine zone, and then there will be more euryhaline species which can tolerate varying amount of salinity in the system. And as you can see, when you have a plot, then you will see the varying concentration of fishes in the different streams, different region of the river in the mainstream. And then we can also calculate the health based on the composition of the fish, but we have to have Indian examples for that. Okay, and then there are large number of microcosm studies, where within the laboratory they have now, with a series of modern experiments, they have proved that each part of the river segment has its own unique flora, and how much energy is transferred in, through these organisms. Everything is now established with the laboratory studies, with the very fine studies in the recent past, and where they play very and modern studies very clearly specify that it's actually the organisms which are unseen play a very important role. For example, microbes in the form of biofilms. That means each and every sand particle is covered by several thousands of microbes which actually act as a biofilm, and each one of them play a very, very critical role in maintaining the health of the river system. So it's actually the microbes which play a very, very important role. And the modern study, actually, I was reading a paper a few months back, and the study clearly says that the organism which dominate the planet in terms of biodiversity are the microbes. And the largest biomass in the planet is nothing but microbes, and they live in the ocean. Okay, that means they live in the ocean. And the recent estimate, for example, if you look at a quiz for the school children, how many organisms are there in the planet? Okay, everybody came with 2 million. Okay, this is the latest report, 2 million organisms. But the recent studies based on metagenomics clearly shows that there will be around 10 raised to 17 microbial species across the world. Then our concept of life is actually changing. Even there are a lot of study about the human gut flora, gut microbe, and it's actually several thousands within the system, which ultimately maintain our health. Then you can understand, the way they play a role in the system, in the ecosystems. Okay, so then along with the water flow, they recharge groundwater, they self-purify water, and they provide food for a large number of organisms. They maintain the food web, and then they clean the water in the system, and they supply the water to the downstream area. So a lot of functions there. And in all the modern functions, for example, the recreation, the flood erosion control, the cleaning of water, the clean water which provide, the water supply it maintains, the food it actually provides, the habitat it provides to a series of organisms, and it also support the migrating flora and fauna. Everything is very, very important. So what I would tell you specifically is that you need to understand the connectivity between the ecosystem. That means when you study the river, don't study about the river alone, because the river supplement the resources to a series of systems. There will be headwaters. In the case of Kerala, it may be the Western Ghats. In the northern states, it may be the Himalayas. Okay, and then it supply a series of the river continuum concept is there. There will be flow of matter and energy downstream, and ultimately the coastal productivity is also maintained by the river. So this is the holistic understanding of the river. And also when you look at the conservation of the river, and when you have a management plan, you have to look at the micro systems, the micro watersheds. As you can see here, each one of the colored segments are micro watershed, and these are actually the health of the river. Unfortunately, what we do is we construct a series of check dams in the downstream, and that will not actually provide water. And if you really wanted to recreate the health of the river, ultimately what you have to do, you have to actually maintain the health of the watersheds, which ultimately determine the health of the system. And that means the river conservation should start from the mountains. Okay, from the in the case of Himalayas, it should start from the mountainscapes. Okay, and when it comes down, then you can see a series of other organisms, and then where we have to think about the carbon sequestration of all these systems. And for example, the organisms in the coastal region, for example, that means they are doing a dual role there. So they are the best carbon sequestrators available in the planet, because they supplement water to the soil as well. And then so they play a very important role. And so the biogeography of the river is very important in maintaining the conservation. Okay, and then when you go for the conservation, you need to understand the socio-economic values, the way the role it plays in maintaining hydrological cycle, in maintaining fresh water, food security of large number of people, etc., etc. So all these things are connected together. Then I will come to the concept of the ecosystem services. So whenever you think about, or whenever you are involved in educating people about the rivers, and this is very important, tell them the role of the ecosystem services in terms of supporting services, for example, the nutrient recycling, soil formation, etc., etc., and the provisioning services, which we always remember, because it provides some provisions to human beings in the form of products like the food, water, timber, etc., regulating services, the way in which it regulates the regional climate, for example, and the way in which it purify water, etc., etc., and then cultural services, which you are all familiar with, the cultural services of the system. And there are large number of exercises done in different parts of the world, calculating the value, economic value of the inland wetlands, And all of them very clearly establish that they are very, very important in the modern terms of transferring the value in economic terms. And there is a toolbox, probably you can also try and experiment, GlobeAqua. It's a toolbox which actually provide a comprehensive compilation of methods to measure river ecosystem functioning, GlobeAqua. And it's actually a website wherein you can determine the river ecological ecosystem functioning and its value. You can assess the value also by putting in your local data, and then that you can try. And also the pressures in the system, probably the short-term and long-term pressures. I'll be discussing few things. Already I am not detailing that. For example, the issue of dams. And the more than dams, it's actually how it ultimately result in fragmentation of the system, and especially how the water is specifically drawn for settling the demands of the urban population, and ultimately how it make the rural population water deprived in many of the systems. And these are all social issues connected with that, and it's happening across the world, as you can see in this map, a recent paper. And this is just to make you aware that what is happening in the northern India, in the Alakananda river basin, a typical example. And all these marks from 1 to 55 are the dams in a single river basin. Okay, it's almost 100 dams in a single river basin. All are under construction phase, happening in India. And a few years back, I was traveling to Bhutan. And then, the Indian engineers also now give advices for them to make dams on all the small rivers in Bhutan. Okay, and this is the way in which actually the problems actually transferred from one country to another country where people live in with a much better happiness index than India. Anyway, that's a different story. And also, unfortunately, another project which they were involved in is actually sewage-fed fish culture. In a state where the people were living happily with the rivers, and you can see in all the rivers in Bhutan, you will see the flags flying, okay, and as symbols of peace they consider. Anyway, so these are all the changes which, and then look at the Uttarakhand tragedy which happened in 2021, connected with the climate change, connected with the land use changes, and all these red dots you see along the Himalayan belt there are all dams. And all the blue dots there are all glacial lakes. And then we are actually we are inviting disasters primarily through the landscape changes in the entire basin, and again unscientific land management practices. And then the people in North India traveling to Kerala usually tells me that yahan se haryali shuru hoti hai, wahan se Kerala. Okay, fine. That's fine. But the problem is that, it all depends upon how much water is available in the river, surface water availability, and that is less because we have a large number of people here. Population density is so high. So that means our priorities should actually change. And then coming back to the issues, the core issues, why do we fail? And the reason is that in India, if you look at general, there are many things which are common. If you look at the river conservation issues, one, the major issue is fragmentation of the river. The river is fragmented because of dams, because of diversions, and then ultimately there is no flow between the dams, and there is less flow downstream. This is one of the major issues. And deteriorating water quality, ultimately our discussions are concentrated only on deteriorating water quality alone. But that is only one aspect of river management that you should understand. And then floodplain farming is again a major issue because of less availability of water. Fish catch in all the river basins. For example, if you look at Ganga and Yamuna rivers in India, the major fish catch is now supported by invasive species. Again, I am not discussing that because we have a section tomorrow specifically on that. And for example, all the regions, all the major fish landing centers in Ganga, the catch is dominated by invasive species like tilapia and African catfish in the last 1 decade. So all the native fishes are gone in that sense. Then riparian ecosystems are, because of our neglect, there is a continuous decline in diversity and quantity. And floodplains have cut off river flows because of land use changes. and salinity traveling deep into the inland. In all the river systems in India, there is saltwater intrusion, and basins are closing, because of, again, land use changes, and in the coastal area, in Krishna and Kaveri, all these things are changes. And sand mining, pollution, where Dr. Padmalal also will talk in the next lecture, and a lot of other changes happening. Okay, and then we have a separate session on environmental flows, and that is what probably in India we have to think. And in River Ganges, Indian government has also now intervened and started thinking about ensuring environmental flow downstream the river, and these are very important, and there is a separate session. I am not detailing that, but only thing is that, after the river, after a dam, you have to ensure that minimum quantity of water flows through the river, so that the river health is maintained. This is the basic argument for that. And the river continuum concept we discussed, and that for river to function as an ecosystem, biological entity, ecological entity, you need to ensure that the minimum quantity of water is available in all the segments of the river, so that the health is maintained. So this is actually a concept. Okay, and again, I am coming back to the Brisbane declaration, which I discussed in the first slide. Okay, and what is the essence of that? One, the declaration in 2018 demands or put forward an idea that the environmental flows should be maintained in all the river systems across the world. And primarily because if you really wanted to ensure ecological, cultural connectivity of the river, then you have to ensure that the river maintains minimum quality of water. And then the ultimate philosophy is that the central recommendation: develop and implement a legal basis for regulating water use, because water use is again connected. The major water use of the humans come from the river basins. And the environmental flows, water rights and licenses, including recognition of cultural heritage values, knowledge and customary relationship with water. So that means it's actually something comprehensive and holistic argument. That means it's not just maintaining the ecological integrity, but you have to ensure that the cultural services, the knowledge, the customer relationship, everything with the water is actually maintained. That means we need to recognize the right of the river to live, and also the right of the water, and all things have to be comprehensively taken into account when we plan about conservation of river basin, and that's actually the idea. And also, you also have to understand some of the political changes that's happening in the country, and this is all the news came from North India primarily. And North India, I see last year 2021, almost 136 people were killed in sand mining violence and accidents in 16 months. It's not a simple issue, because sand mining is a very serious illegal operation along the river basin happening in all the areas. And also the officials who are actually trying to protect the landscape and maintaining law and order. Almost 58 government officials were very brutally handled by the sand mafia in India. And also, because of poor land management practices, several people are killed every year because of poor sand mining practices that's there in the system. So all these things again demand that the resources are unsustainably harvested. Okay, and the pollution content and overexploitation of resources, invasive alien species, these are all, and climate change, these are all associated issues. And finally, to the final segment of my talk, again before the discussion, and why in India the river conservation is not coming up as a people's movement. And the reason is that it's not I started with an argument that in India river is actually an emotional issue. It's actually it flows through the heart. But for many people it remains only as an emotional issue and not coming beyond that. That's one of the issue. Then second is that for as any other solution, we need quick fix solutions. That means you need immediate answer. Just like politicians, you tell me 5 important strategies to preserve a river so that river flows from the next year onwards. This will never happen, because it's actually the biological system. For any river to flow back in its original capacity, which will never happen, primarily because we have changed the land use. We have changed the landscape completely. But you have to start from the mountains. You have to strengthen the watershed, and then the watershed strengthening involves civil engineers, work of a large number of people who have to actually work for several years to re-establish the health of the watersheds. Then you have to wait several years so that the vegetation appears, and ultimately the water is absorbed by the system, and then the first order stream started flowing from the degraded the systems. That means it will take several years. That means immediately for a political system for 5 years it will not happen. Okay, that means it will take its own time. So river management system require time, scientific interventions. So that means we need to be patient. There is no quick fix solution. There is no one-word answer for that question. Okay, and then the issue is that we always work for temporary solutions, not a permanent solution or a long-term solution. For example, if there is a pollution issue in river Ganges, it cannot be actually controlled by a government order. Okay, it takes a lot of time. It need actually involvement of the stakeholders, etc. And there is no temporary solution. For example, in Kerala, for example, there are a lot of demand for retaining water in the river system. What is the solution? Many of the local bodies, they demand for the check dams all across the main channel of the river. It can retain water, but it cannot actually regenerate a river. It's entirely different philosophies. It can retain water. A check dam built in a river can retain water for some time. It may also replenish wells in the nearby panchayats. Yes, but ultimately it will not actually do any kind of services for the health of the river. Okay, because ultimately you are stopping the underground flows as well. Okay, then we don't have a scientific planning. Even now we don't have a scientific planning for river restoration as far as India is concerned. There is no integrated river basin management plan. Of course, some examples are coming up. This is another requirement. So through this training, probably what MSSRF also envisages actually to create a lot of networking across the country and small groups so that we can develop databases on the river systems about the water availability, about the hydrological balance, hydrology, etc., so that the people will be aware of the importance of the system. Unfortunately, our education system also, including our department where we teach aquatic biology, many of the students never even entered the river system. And the parents stop the student, no, never enter a stream, never enter a river, because that's ultimately their death bell comes from that. In India, every year, several lakhs of people die because of road accidents. And because of drowning, there will be only few thousand deaths. So we have to understand the real facts, what is happening within the country. So we consider it as the water flow or a river as actually something threatening an ecosystem. That's again the concept should change. We should understand basics about the hydrological cycle, how it actually is connected with poverty, how it is sustainable with it is connected with the maintaining sustainable development goals. Almost all these sustainable development goals can be managed once you have a better management of the ecosystems as well as water in the system. Again, this is important. And also how we can bring in the concept of ecosystem approach for the conservation of river, and whether we can try something called the integrated river basin management, which is ultimately required in India, because a river is actually a system which cannot be managed by a single department. We need actually a kind of river authority to handle the issues, because it's actually multiple departments are involved in ensuring the conservation. And we need a bottom-up approach, because ultimately the river conservation should start from the watersheds or the mountains, and that is where this is important. And then we have government level initiatives, which probably you are aware, like National River Water Conservation Directorate we have in Ministry of the Environment, and we have a National Lake Conservation Plan, National River Conservation Plan at the Government of India level. Then look at the major thrust areas of Government of India. It's not a criticism, but you have to again look at the priority area set. It is required, of course. For example, they have only Ganga in their mind. That's fine. That's fine for managing a river. But the problem is that out of the total budget allocated for the National Clean Ganga Mission, 80% of the money goes for construction work. 80% of the money goes for the construction work. That means in the diversion work, sewage treatment plant, then sanitation, the electric crematorium, all these things are important, but ultimately they will not do anything for ensuring the health of the river systems. And then again, recently, most of the money is given for riverfront development. Okay, this is also you should understand. Riverfront development is nothing but the marginal areas of the river are used as tourism destinations. You build concrete the structures along the river basin and ultimately bring in create these areas as tourism destinations and including improvement of bathing ghats. Okay, and then afforestation and public awareness is the last component where only 5% of the total grant is allocated. Okay, so this is just to make you aware that this is what is happening with regard to the national level river restoration programs. Yes.
Can you looking out the waterways? We are planning from Haldia.
That is true, because I am speaking only about this clean Ganga mission. Yes, that is also there. That's a separate program. That is not connected directly with this, I believe. Yeah. So that means, so we again, even the political system need some kind of reorientation as to what exactly are required for the conservation of a river or restoration of a river. So all these things are important. And if you look at the river health assessment model, which earlier Professor Ramachandra also talked, there are important components. For example, they look at different components, including see how complicated this is. I'm not detailing that, primarily because if you really wanted to have an example of river restoration, you need to look at the river water flow, catchment health, river health, then biotic health, and then the socio-economic security of the people around that. Then whether it is possible, why the government systems actually fail in delivering the goods, we have good examples. Better examples in India. For example, we have an example at Naporia, a village in Rajasthan, where this man called Rajendra Singh intervened. And it was not actually a government system, it was actually a participatory system where the people involved. What he does is very simple. He initially tracked the original path of the river, which is lost, and then went back to the watersheds and then mobilized people and asked them to intervene in the watershed and watershed restoration. In 10 years' time, then he could see that the river actually started flowing back. So it again exemplifies the way in which the participatory role of the people is very, very important. Stakeholders' role are very, very important. And that is specifically important primarily because we are now entering into the next phase of United Nations decade of ecosystem restoration, 2021-2030, where we need to discuss very strongly, and probably this is the beginning. What MSSRF does here is a beginning where we don't have actually a specific national level plan for ecosystem restoration or river restoration in India, but you cannot actually have a national level plan also. That is very important. You cannot have a plan for Ganga as well as a river in the Western Ghats as a single package. It should be actually practiced locally and modified according to the local situations, but you can have an overarching policy on river restoration in that sense. Okay, and finally to conclude and end, there is an argument that whether ecosystem restoration, which is practiced better in the Western countries, is it good for India? We have few examples only in India. One example is actually Chilka restoration, which was done more or less in a decent manner in India, where ultimate economic analysis says that for every 1 rupee spent, there was actually a gain of 15 rupees. Ultimately, when the project ended, which is actually an indication that if you invest money on restoration, ultimately the ecosystem values and services, and if you calculate the economic value, and that will be always better. That means it's actually a long-term investment for the future when we work with the ecosystem restoration. I end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for an inspiring session. So I think I hope we already had a couple of queries, and if we can take a couple of pressing queries, we can move forward to Dr. Patnalal, who is already there. Yeah, please.
which is about 200 wells per square kilometers. And when you go upwards towards the mountain highlands and high ranges, comes down to around, as you go down to the coastal, it varies between 70 to 200. Despite that, the water availability is per capita would be less. Is it because it is not sufficient since our food habits? We have rice as staple, which is a water-intensive crop, and there are other factors where I've noticed. I've lived in several states in India, and I've noticed that there is definitely more water consumption with respect to daily use, as in cleaning the house. People from the state end up using more water to clean the house. Yeah. So when that gets accumulated, is it because our lifestyle habits require more water that it is not sufficient? Because if you look at the well density, how else can we? That is the highest in the world. So how else can we make use of the surface water? And almost 80%. Again, that varies between the more urbanized coast and the less sparsely populated mountain areas. But around 65 to 80% is dependent on open surface wells. So how do we ensure that do we have to change our food habits? I mean, going from rice to something else would be disastrous. And it's not just Kerala, all over Southeast Asia, rice is the staple. But that is a water-intensive crop. And yet we are not, I mean, there are varieties like Pokali, which are saline tolerant and they're flood resistant, but the government isn't really doing much to encourage its practice, even though that's a century-old practice. So how do we ensure that we're consuming less water?
No, yeah, that again, see, this is again a question which is connected with the water literacy as well. You know, a state like Kerala need to be strongly moved towards the water literacy campaigns, where of course it's actually not the farming practices which actually deplete water in the state, but it is actually the way in which we misuse water, and this is the major issue. And the Pokali issue which you talked is again important, especially as a means of adaptation, especially with regard to the climate change as well as flooding of the coastal waters, wherein we have only lesser choices left, where Pokali can play a very, very important role. But again, there are issues. The primary issue is again the way in which the coastal development plans are coming up in the state, where many of the players actually don't want the rice fields to be as such in the system, and that is again multiple interest and the corporate interest, political interest, all play a very, very important role in determining the sustainability of very unique ecosystem. Not only Pokali, we have another system called Kaipat, which is in the northern part of Kerala. All are basically the ecological farming practices, evolved along with along the time. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm afraid we are having a hybrid program, both offline and online. So a couple of people are always waiting online from 2 p.m. And Dr. Patnalal has also arrived. So we'll move to the next session. Definitely you'll get a chance to interact with Dr. Biju.